And today we are going to focus on 10 research-based tips to develop skilled, confident readers. The flow for the session is I am going to briefly share findings from a research article or chapter, and then translate that into a quick teaching tip that you can hopefully try out this week or next week in your reading instruction with very little prep needed, or hopefully no prep at all. So that is our flow. Let me show you our 10 topics for today. These are going to be our 10 research-based tips tonight. And the first 3 are going to be around decoding phonics. These are going to be for readers in kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade, sounding out words, reading multisyllabic words, and how to use context when reading. After those 3, then we're going to go into 2 tips focused on how students interact with each other. So what does the research say about student discussions, and what does the research say about peer feedback? And then our final 5 research-based tips are all about the conditions necessary to develop skilled, confident readers. So what does the research say about reading volume, the role of interest in reading, motivation, reading levels, and the love of reading? So with that, these are going to be our 10 tips that we dive into, and almost all of our research is going to come from one of these 4 places. On the left-hand side, we have 2 peer-reviewed journals. The first, Reading Research Quarterly, the second, Scientific Studies of Reading, and on the right-hand side, we have 2 handbooks of research. We have the Handbook of Research on Reading Comprehension and What Research Has to Say About Reading Instruction. So these are going to be our 4 sources today. Let's go ahead and begin with the first 3 tips. And with these first 3 tips, I'm going to show one video, and then I'm going to share multiple visual resources. And for all the teachers and principals on the call, you'll have access to all of these visuals after the training. So let's go ahead and dive in with number 1. So thinking about sounding out words, one of the most important researchers, academics around phonics is Linnea Airey, and she's out of City University of New York. And she wrote both of these articles, both published in 2020. And one question that she was answering was, what is the best method to teach a child how to sound out a word? And she was looking at 2 different methods. The research way to say it is connected phonation or segmented phonation. All that means is connected phonation means that when you sound out a word, you don't stop between the sounds. You kind of sing it or you say it all together. So if we're thinking about the word rat, connected phonation sounds like rat. That's one method. And then the other method that she was looking at was segmented phonation. That's where you stop between the sounds. So if you have rat, you would sound it out r, a, t. And so she was looking in her studies, looking at both methods and looking at a lot of different schools and just asking which method works better. And in the research, it was 100% clear, no question, that connected phonation is better. That students learn to read words faster if they hold all the sounds of the word and they don't stop between the sounds. This intuitively makes sense because a child's ability to read a word is dependent upon the child hearing a word that they know. So they're sounding something out and they're trying to match it to a word that they know. Connie Jewell out of Stanford, she calls this a shaky representation. When you sound out a word, it's not perfect. It's a shaky representation of the word, and the child has to match that shaky representation of the word to a word that they know. For an emergent reader, if they hear r, a, t, maybe they can hear rat. But if they hear rat, it's more likely that they can hear the word and then they can read it. And so that's the research behind it. And then the tip is, if you are teaching an emergent reader how to sound out, teach them that they can sing the sounds and don't stop between the sounds. And so when you're teaching them, you can tell them you should sing it. It should sound like this, rat. And then they practice doing it like that. And then anytime they're trying to sound out a word, they sing it as they go. One more tip here. It's the vowel that is both the key and the trouble. With early readers, if they can get their vowels right, they have a much higher likelihood of learning to read faster and earlier than students who struggle with their vowels. When they sound it out and they sing, it's the vowel that you really want to hold. So you really want to hear at, and then you want to bring it together as rat. So that's the tip. And so now I want to show a 1-minute video where Rachel Shin, she's in Brooklyn with her kindergartners. She's going over the vowel sounds. This is how we start both our guided reading and our phonics and fluency lessons. And she's going over them and she's having the students say it and hold it for about 2 seconds. So they're not going to say a apple ah, they're going to say a apple ah, and then that gets them ready to sound out where they sing the sounds and they don't stop. So let's see this quick video.
Good job, us.
Good job, us.
Vowels, ready, go. Vowels are
A-E-I-O-U. O-F-R. E-A-N. U-F-R. I-N-N. A-Apple-A.
good job. Side. Sound it out.
Hug. Mug. Cat.
This, what letter is this?
B.
B. Get ready.
Egg. Big.
Us.
Good job, us.
Silent. E.
Rachel, she is implementing all of the research that we heard. She is making sure that her kids are just singing all the way through, no stopping. And then when she's doing those vowel sounds, she's having them hold them for 2 seconds. So hopefully that is something for anybody who has emergent readers in your classroom. We're going to share this visual with you, and hopefully that's something you can start using right away. So with that, let's go on to the second tip. So the second tip is still staying on decoding and word solving, but we're thinking about multisyllabic words, right? So more than one syllable. And here we are going to be using the research from Devin Kearns. He's a professor out of the University of Connecticut. And he published a paper in 2020 in Reading Research Quarterly in their special issue of the Science of Reading. And you can see what the question is here that he has. Does English have useful syllable division patterns? In other words, should we be teaching our students, when they get to a multisyllabic word, should we be teaching them to chunk based on syllable type, based on syllable rules? And what he did to figure this out, he analyzed 15,000 words that show up in grades 1 through 8 to first just ask, do these words actually follow the rules? The rules that we're teaching kids, do the words follow those rules? And here is what he said after analyzing those 15,000 words. The data suggests that syllable division is the wrong kind of help for a child because of the inconsistency of the rules. And so essentially, he found so many exceptions to how we traditionally teach kids the different types of syllable, break it here, do this. There are so many exceptions that he said, one, it doesn't warrant explicit instruction. And he said, two, it's also just too time intensive. It takes too much energy. If a child is reading a book and they have to slow down and spend a minute on a word by figuring out the syllables and kind of how to read this word, their fluency obviously is going to go down, which is going to impact their comprehension. So his answer is no. But what he does say is that students need rules for chunking words, but they need to be simple, fast, and flexible. Simple, fast, and flexible. And so the way that we do that at Lifelong Readers is we use a visual like this. And we tell a child, you can chunk a word any way that you want to chunk it, but it needs to be small, okay? And it needs to be easy to read. And so if you are chunking this word and each chunk is small and it's easy for you to read and you can put it together, then that's a method that works for you. But if it's not small or it's not easy to read, you need to try again. And so that's kind of the flexibility piece. And so this is the visual. And then we teach them some simple rules. So 2 rules that we teach all kids right away with chunking. Every chunk has to have a vowel. So it has to be small, it has to be easy to read, and it has to have a vowel. And then the second one is you can't separate what we call with students as a sound combination, what you might call a digraph, 2 letters that make one sound. You cannot separate your sound combination. So you can't separate S and H, you can't separate T and H. So we do that, and then we have children just use those methods and be flexible. If it works, awesome. If it doesn't, just try again. The last thing I want to say here is we don't have to force children into specific ways to chunk. If you look at this visual for a second and you look at column C, you see pretend, moment, and realize. If we look at pretend and moment for a while, those are chunked along the syllable lines to be pre-intend, to be mo and meant. But you will have students successfully chunk these words. For example, I just saw this the other day with a second grader. She chunked the word moment as mom-int. She said, my chunks are mom-int. I said, does that sound like a word you know? She said, yep, it's moment. And so we need to be flexible with children. They may chunk it one way, read the parts, and then they're able to match it to a word they know. So here you want to be simple, fast, and flexible, and then that way children are get lots of practice with chunking multisyllabic words, which will make them more successful over time. Okay, last one on phonics. The last one on phonics is this article here, using context when reading. This is also out of Reading Research Quarterly, and this one is on out of their special issue on the science of reading on one of them. And what these researchers are saying, Donna Scanlon's the primary researcher, she is responding to the education field, and she is saying there are some people, not researchers, but there are some people who are advocating for children to not use context and not use meaning when they read, to only use phonics. And what she's saying in this article is, that is wrong. That is not research-based. And so she presents 25 years of research to show that kids need both. They need phonics and code-based systems, and they also need to be using meaning and context. And she says this for a number of different reasons. But one is that a reader should never separate meaning from when they're reading. They should always be trying to make meaning from the text. But the second one that's really important is English is a non-transparent language. Your phonics will fail you at some point. We have 44 speech sounds. We have 216 representations. Some people say 50 to 60% of English words have some sort of irregularity in them. And so you're going to need context to help you. But here is the important part. Phonics and context are not equal players here. And so when we teach this to students, we have a visual for how to use context or meaning when you read, but we never teach it by itself. When you see this visual, you are always going to see it accompanied by a phonics strategy first. And so we teach students, first and foremost, if you're in grades kindergarten and first, you want to sound out a word. You want that to be your major strategy. That's the first thing you do. And then you want to check to make sure that it makes sense, right? You want to use that to check to see, how did my sounding out go for me? It's the exact same thing in grades 1 and 2. Chunk it first. And when you chunk, look for your sound combinations, your word families, everything that you know about phonics. And then also ask yourself, does it make sense in the context of what I'm reading? And so I think if we can teach students that this is a really important strategy, but it's not your first strategy. Let phonics be your first one, and then check to make sure that it makes sense. Okay, so those are our three, right up here, those are our three research-based tips on phonics. So from here, we move to our research-based tips on how students interact with each other. And so now this encompasses kindergarten all the way through 12th grade and beyond. And so let's begin with student discussions. So for this one, we're going to go into the Handbook of Research on Reading Comprehension. And we're going to go into a chapter, Constructing Meaning Through Discussion. So what they're doing, what these authors are doing, is they are looking at a bunch of different studies to say, what do we know about discussion and conversation that lifts the level of student comprehension? And so what they do is they start by saying this, that everybody in the research world agrees that students need to talk to each other about what they're reading. They need to talk to each other about their inferences, their summaries, all of those things. And then they say, that in US classrooms, there aren't very many student discussions. What researchers see mostly is teacher, student, and not a discussion. So that's important for us to know. We have to have students talking to each other about what they're reading and not just that teacher-student back and forth. But then they say, even when students are talking to each other, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's enhancing their comprehension. And so what they did was they described 3 different ways of students talking to each other. 2 are not helpful at all. They won't lift the level of comprehension, and 1 is really helpful. And so here is what they described. The first is what they call disputational talk. All it means is that it's characterized by disagreement. Kids won't take on each other's ideas. Kids are uncooperative with each other. They're competitive with each other. They're arguing for argument's sake. Of course, that doesn't help anybody's comprehension. So that's 1. Disputational talk, kids arguing all day long is not going to help anybody. But the second one I think is equally interesting is that they describe something called cumulative talk. And when they describe cumulative talk, this was when students always agreed with each other. No matter what somebody said, they were really encouraging. And they said, you know what, I agree with you. I agree with what you're saying, and I want to say this. I agree with what you're saying, and I want to build on this. But they never challenged each other. That also did not lead to higher levels of comprehension. Of course, it was more peaceful. The kids were kinder to each other. It felt better, but it didn't enhance the level of comprehension. And then the researchers described, the one that does lift the level, and they call it exploratory talk. I don't think the name really matters, but what they say in exploratory talk is that students can engage with each other's ideas critically and constructively. That we engage with somebody's idea, and that an idea is not taken right away as yes or no, but that an idea is put on the table and that we can critically and constructively engage with it. And that is what enhances students' comprehension. So when we think about this third type of talk, where kids are engaging critically and constructively, at Lifelong Readers, we use this type of visual. It changes based on the grade level. On the left is typically what we use with kindergarten. On the right is what we use with second graders. And so we teach that, this is the way that we're going to talk to each other about our ideas. But the key here is it's based on the evidence, right? You can have any perspective, any opinion in the world that you want to have, but it must be based on the evidence. And so what I would love to do right now is to show 2 different clips. One clip on the left, I am teaching kindergartners in Southern Indiana, and these kindergartners have never had a guided reading lesson before. They haven't had a group conversation where they're discussing a text. So they're going to do this for the very first time. They've read a really simple book, and they're going to retell the story together. And we're going to teach these kiddos for the very first time how we agree and disagree with somebody's ideas based on evidence. That's the first clip. And then I want to show what it looks like 2 to 3 years later once kids have done this over time. So let's start by watching this first clip, thinking about how do we teach very young ages of learners how to engage productively in these types of conversations. So let's take a look here. We can also, when our friend goes, we can either agree with what they say because that's what happened in the book, or we can disagree with what they say because that's not what happened in the book. Show me agree. Show me disagree. Okay, perfect.
Next hero is kicking in the pool.
Agree or disagree? Okay. Do you disagree? Okay, so if you disagree, what I'm going to do is, Benjamin, what you have to do is give her your evidence. So everybody look up here. If somebody disagrees with you, and I'll take this down because we're good with this one, then you just have to show them your evidence. And evidence is a picture or words to prove your answer. So you can either show her in the picture that he's kicking or in the words. Benjamin, go ahead.
He's kicking.
Point to it. Okay, so he's showing your evidence. Is that evidence that he's kicking? Yeah, so then you need to agree because there's evidence. Good job showing your evidence.
Next hero is
What do you guys think? Next little boys in the floaty, thumbs up or thumbs down? You can only disagree if there's no evidence. If it did not happen in the book, there's no picture, there's no words, then you can disagree. But if somebody shows you the picture and they show you the evidence, you need to agree. So tell us again, Sophie, where's the evidence? Point to where the boy is floating in the water. Right there. Okay. Yeah, here, is the boy floating in the water? Yeah? Is the boy sitting on the water? Is he floating on this? Yeah, then what do you need to do? Agree? Or yeah, you need to agree because there's evidence. And when there's evidence, you have to agree. Okay, we're good? All right, let's turn the page. Day one kindergarten clip, how we teach students to start to have these critically but also constructive conversations with each other. So with that, now I want to show a second clip, and this is just a minute and a half, but what I want to show now is Danielle Blair. She's also in Brooklyn, and these are her second graders. These kiddos have had these kinds of conversations from kindergarten, first, second grade. They've had it for 3 years, the end of their second grade year, through Lifelong Readers with their guided reading instruction. So let's take a look at this clip and see how the students engage with each other when they have a disagreement.
So he did a trick so that the seed didn't sprout, so he boiled it so that the next emperor is that person.
No, he didn't boil it because he wanted that person. He just wanted to know who was honest and said that it didn't grow. Because it was supposed to not grow. Because it's boiled.
Where's his next guy?
Yes.
Wait. So that he boiled the seed so that the person who gets that seed is going to be the next emperor.
The person who does.
That's evidence. Yeah. Can you guys tell me that's evidence? You have?
Yes. That's a great idea.
I think there's no evidence. Look in the book. I think.
Make sure you tell us what page you're on.
14. Suddenly, to his surprise, Chang heard the emperor shout, "I found him! I've discovered the child work of becoming the next emperor."
I disagree with you because I think the text evidence that I found is that the seeds I gave everyone were boiled. They could never have sprouted. But this honest, brave child told me the simple truth.
Wow.
One comment about that video, but before I do, I just opened up the chat. If you could, in the chat, just put out any thoughts that you have as you are watching the students interact with each other, and then any takeaways that you have, anything that you're seeing like, oh, okay, this is something I could put into my classroom practice. It could either be from this video here on the discussion or with the phonics tips as well. I think that clip is so hilarious because Mason, the little boy, you probably picked up in the corner. He is 100% correct in this situation. And so it always cracks me up when he says about the evidence, that's a great idea that we should go back into the text and the way he kind of read his evidence. But even with that, we see the students just engaging with each other's ideas, right? Engaging with each other's ideas. It doesn't have to be personal. We don't have to argue about this. We can just get right back to the text. So that's what I have there. And I would say as you're thinking about student discussions, I would say you have to have some sort of visual, some sort of reference for how we're going to engage with each other in this conversation. And then you also just have to make sure that the text is the center. Everything that we do are going to go back to the text. And then a few final tips before we just move on to the next one. And that is that as a teacher, you will probably have to have this conversation with at least one of your groups, if not everybody in your class. And that's this conversation. It sounds like this. Friends, we can't always agree with each other. If we're always agreeing with each other, then what that tells me is you're not thinking for yourself, right? But we also can't always disagree with each other, because if you always disagree with each other, then you're kind of being difficult. You're being hard to get along with. So there should be moments in every single lesson where we agree and where we disagree with each other, and it has to be based on the evidence. So that kind of helps this type of conversation as well. And then we also have some comments coming in. So let me see what we have. So Maya was picking up that in the second clip with Danielle, that the teacher barely spoke. The students were doing everything. After having this in kindergarten, first and second grade, they can guide the conversation, and the teacher is there just as a facilitator. And absolutely, Maya, she really did barely speak at all. I think at one point she said, make sure you tell us what page you're on, just so that everybody else can be. And then she had to go deal with something else that happened in the class, which always happens to us. Great. And then Eve is asking, are signs used to go along with the other components, the agree, the disagree? Yeah, every teacher does it a little bit different. I think that in all of our schools, there's an agree or a disagree sign, whatever that is. And then there's also kind of a build on sign that goes with it like this. And then from there, it just depends teacher by teacher. But yeah, we do have one visual per grade level. And then what happens is with the next grade level, you always keep what came before it, and you add new techniques on, new ways that we're going to talk about the book. And I'll send these out after the session. Great. And then Shannon is saying that you can see that there's been so much consistency from these students, from their teachers, from the systems, from the structures, that they've internalized them. And that one little boy asked, the group was kind of listening to the two little kids go back and forth until finally another child said, hey, can you show me your evidence for that? And so the students have listened to the teacher say this so many times that now he also knows I can ask for evidence as well. And you can also see on the bottom left-hand corner of the one on the right, that clarify bucket. One thing that we teach kids to say to each other is, what evidence do you have for that idea? Or why do you think that? And so we see him doing that as well. Okay, great comments. Thank you for those. And now let me go ahead and move us to number 5. So when we're looking at number 5, peer feedback. This is about students giving feedback to each other. And this is coming out of Reading Research Quarterly, and also a webinar intensive from Steve Graham. So Steve Graham is out of Arizona State University. I think he's one of the most important researchers on writing, and then also one of the most important researchers on how reading and writing are completely connected and how they impact one another. He is fantastic. So one thing that he has said through his papers and when he's teaching courses is he does meta-analysis. So he does his own research, but he will also look at 50, 60, 80, 100 studies and say, what are the patterns in these studies? What can we learn from them? One is that when a child gives feedback to another child, it is far more impactful than when that child receives the feedback. That there is something that if I can identify it in your writing or in your retell or something, if I can tell you what to do, then I am actually reinforcing that skill inside of myself, and I'm going to do it better in the future. And so he gives multiple examples. He gives an example where a child has been given feedback on how to use punctuation 1,000,000 times from the teacher. And then the teacher starts putting in place peer feedback, where that teacher, where two students are looking at each other's papers about at the same level, something like this, giving feedback. And all of a sudden, this student sees that this student's not using punctuation. And after giving this student that feedback, then all of a sudden, this student starts to use punctuation. That this is just a super powerful tool. If we can set it up for kids to give feedback to each other, then every piece of feedback they give, they're giving it back to themselves in a more powerful way. So one thing that Steve Graham says, there's two things that he says. To make this successful, one is you have to set it up positively. It has to be a situation where you give positive feedback to each other and you give constructive feedback to each other. That is absolute key. And the second thing he said is limit what they can give feedback on. It's really challenging to give feedback to somebody. And so it can't be anything in the world that you can give somebody feedback on. It needs to be a couple of things, 2 things, 3 things. Keep it focused. Kids will be successful and they will start to grow. And so we have taken this research and really put it into place where students are having those student discussions, especially when they're summarizing the text. And we encourage them to give feedback to each other on how they're doing in the retell or in the summary. And we tell them, because we teach the summary in this way at this level, it's different at every level, but in first grade it looks like this. You have to go in order in your retell. You have to use your own words. You can't read directly from the text when you retell or summarize. And you have to base your summary on the text, not the picture. And if you can't remember, just reread. So this is the method that students use to summarize or retell a text. And so we strategically stop in moments in the lesson to let kids give feedback to each other. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. It's less than a minute. This is Ariel Page, and she is in Memphis, and she's with her first graders doing this. And as you watch, feel free to put anything into the chat that you think is effective, or anything that you might start doing in your classroom to get more peer feedback going on. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the clip.
Daisy said it's just a mind blows.
What do we think? What did Aubrey just do really well? What did she do really well? Go ahead, Alex. What did she do well?
She used her own words.
Okay, she used her own words. What do you think, Armand?
She used the text, not the picture.
Okay, she used the text, not the pictures. Cool. All right, reread. What does he have to do?
He had to use his own words.
Armand, you want to try again, but this time using your own words? Okay, go ahead.
So feel free to drop any more comments right into the chat. Anything you thought was effective, or any ways you might be able to start using peer feedback in your classroom. And then I'll just wrap this one up by saying, it's so much more valuable if kids give feedback to each other than if we are constantly the person in there giving all the feedback. And so if you can set up the structures to make this work, it's going to have a big payoff. And so the structures are, it has to be positive. We're going to tell each other what we're doing well and what we need to work on. And then we have to limit it. Otherwise, it's overwhelming. So I think it'd be nice to think about, okay, how can I start? I mean, these are first graders. We do it in kindergarten. So, how can I set up these structures so that kids can start to give this feedback to each other? And I see Siobhan has put a comment in. Nice. So Siobhan was noticing that it's a really open-ended question that Ariel here said, what did first she asked, what do we think about that? Every single child said, I agree with what she said. And so then Ariel said, okay, what did she do well? So this big, broad question. And then the kids, they know that we're focused on retelling. We know that we're focused on this is the way that we're going to retell. So they're automatically using, they didn't have to use that visual because I think they have it internalized, but they're pulling out those pieces. And that's exactly what this little girl did. She was using the text. She wasn't relying on the pictures, and she used her own words when she was retelling. And they were able to identify that in first grade. And so then they'll be able to do those things as well. So Siobhan, that is a great point. Thank you. So now here's where we are. We are about halfway finished, and we are finished with the first 5 tips, the first 3 on phonics decoding, and then number 4 and 5 on how students interact with each other. And now these final 5 are, what are the conditions that have to be in place for students to develop into skilled, confident readers? So that is our lens. And let's go ahead and start with our first one, which is reading volume. And so this is coming out of What Research Has to Say About Reading Instruction, Chapter 6, and it's just talking about the importance of independent reading and just the volume, the amount that a child is reading. I'm going to read some direct excerpts from this chapter because I think they're so unbelievably important. So the first one is, the single greatest factor in reading achievement for any person is reading volume, how much reading people do. This is more important than your socioeconomic status. That is unbelievably important, that how much you read is more important than your socioeconomic status in your reading achievement. The second, straight from the chapter, the amount of time spent reading books was the best predictor of growth in reading achievement between grades 2 and 5. Okay, so the amount of time spent reading books. And then the third was that everyone benefits from increasing how much they're reading, but struggling readers benefit more than anybody else. That if we can increase the amount of time a struggling reader is reading, you're going to see bigger gains. And so we oftentimes when I'm working with school leaders, and teachers could do this as well, I encourage people to do an audit. So if you were going to do an audit, you just sit down and you look through your daily schedule and you look at every single subject and you just start to calculate how many minutes per day is a child reading in my classroom. If I go through every single subject, and it doesn't count in this particular calculation if they're being read to, it only counts if they are doing the reading. And so that counts in science and social studies. You can put it all together. And then if you could just make a plan for how do I increase it? How do I, by however many minutes across my day, how do I get my students reading more? You're going to see a big, big impact. Now, that's kind of a bigger idea, but a small tip is to start, and you may already have this in your classroom, but a routine where every child always has a book close to them, a book that they want to read, a book that they like to read, a book that they can read, and it's close. And so then what happens is if they finish early, they grab their book. If they're waiting for the teacher to come to them and they don't have anything else to do, they grab their book. Whatever that down moment is in the classroom, they automatically know I can go straight to my book and I can start reading. That's going to increase volume, and that's like a small thing I think that could have a big impact. It's a little bit easier to do in second, third, fourth, and beyond because kids will have chapter books or longer books. In kindergarten and first grade, what it would require to do is change those books out that they have access to at least weekly, if not every couple of days, a system maybe where you change with your partner or whatever it is. But if they have access, they can read. And then the other thing I want to say is there is great research about young readers rereading decodable stories. So you might be thinking about, I've got a bunch of kindergartners or first graders, and I don't have books that they could just start independently reading. Reread the decodables. Whatever you're using in your classroom, they can have access to that. They can reread it. You're going to see word automaticity, fluency, and rate go up. And I know we've got some comments coming in, so let's see. Great. Great. Eve is also saying that she loves using choral reading through math, through science, through social studies. Fantastic. So especially with younger kids, that choral reading aspect in all subjects is fantastic. And then Amy's saying in the same way that it's a great middle school strategy as well. So you could use it all the way through, which is fantastic. I think one more comment is coming in, so we'll see what that one is. But now let's go ahead. Great. Great. Maya has a very specific question, which is good. Is that research about rereading decodables in the text that you just shared here? That is not in that text. That would be by Timothy Rosinski. And then I can send you the exact article that I'm thinking of. But Tim Rosinski is, I think, he's out of Kent State University. He's going to be one of the most important academics when it comes to fluency. And fluency is so key to a child's comprehension. And so he really pushes rereading, but especially for little kiddos on their decodables, because that's something they can reread. So great question. And now let's go ahead to tip 7, the role of interest. So now Handbook of Research on Reading Comprehension, chapter 24, the role of interest in reading comprehension. So many good things in this chapter, but I'm going to summarize 2. The first thing that the researchers do in this chapter is say that high interest is a buffer for challenge. If a child is interested in something, they can read at a much higher level. Why? Because they're more cognitively active. They care, they're interested, they want to know what's going on. So they're more cognitively active, which makes comprehension come easier to them. And they're twice as likely to persist when challenge comes if they're interested. So interest is so powerful in getting kids into more challenging texts. Second thing was really interesting in this chapter is something I had never seen before, was that they surveyed large groups of adults who would be considered highly successful in today's world. PhDs, MDs, JDs, master's degrees, that kind of thing. And these people didn't learn to read until late. They didn't learn to read until 10, 11, 12 years old. Some with severe dyslexia, some with disabilities that were not identified, but they didn't respond to what the authors said were research validated instruction. They just didn't respond to it. And yet at 10, 11, and 12, they learn to read. And today, they are one of these high achieving individuals. And every single person said it was interest that drove their reading. They were interested in something and they wanted to read about that thing, so they didn't give up on reading. And that honestly gives me chills, because we need kids to not give up on reading. That's really, really important. And especially kiddos who struggle, we need them to not give up on reading and not give up on themselves. And so we have to make sure that they have access to things that they want to read, that they're interested in reading, even if that's outside of one of the subjects that we teach. And so I think that an easy way to do this is think about what kids have access to read in your classroom, and try and expand it just a little bit. Like, what do they have access to right now? And how could I add something new and different that they might be interested in? One strong recommendation is magazines. Magazines come up in the research from elementary to middle school as a very, very high interest. Kids want to read magazines, but they don't have access to magazines. This is the best magazine I have ever seen for kids. And I looked it up. They said it's ages 8 through 14. It's called The Week Junior. It comes weekly. It's very affordable. It's $1.29 a copy. If there are any school leaders that wanted to order for their whole school, I have a contact that could get you a discount. But this, and I went ahead and I brought one up. So let me pull it out for you to show why I think it is just so amazing. It's right here. Okay, so you touch this and it's 32 pages in color. And you open it up and, they start with big world news. And so all of a sudden you have kids, this is a recent magazine. So all of a sudden you have kids reading about what's happening in Iran and what's happening with the women there, what's going on. You have on this right-hand side, you can see severe flooding in Nigeria. And then all of a sudden you move into the national news. So what's going on in the US. And then they have this fantastic, this is when I read this with students, this is almost always 80% of the kids' favorite section in here, because you see all these different things that are happening around the world. But they go beyond the news. They go into animals and the environment. They go into science and technology. They have photos. I mean, I just see kids go crazy for this, to have access for this. It comes out again, it comes out every week. I wrote down $1.29 per issue. And so, I hate the world that we live in where teachers have to buy books and magazines for their classroom. We shouldn't live in that world. It's awful. But if you are in that reality, it would be a little bit of money to spend to even have one issue in your class that could get passed around. And of course, you don't have to just read it in that week. But that's just one example of, making just like the smallest change. Like, let's just expand what our kids have access to, and it could make the biggest difference in their reading trajectory and career. There's that saying that, if you don't like to read, you just haven't found the right book. I do think that's true. So we got to make sure that our kids have access to things that they're interested in. Fantastic. Okay, great. I'll put, and I saw Maya here, I'll put the name of the woman that I know from the Week Junior, and I will put her email for anybody who wants to contact it for a school-wide subscription. And we'll also put it in the email that we send after. Oh, of course. Okay, wonderful. So now we are on to tip 8. This is one of my favorites. So motivation. So, this is intuitive to us as teachers. It's absolutely intuitive, but it is also research backed that a child's motivation is as important as the knowledge that they bring to the text, as the vocabulary that they bring to the text, as their reading skills and their reading strategies. Just as important, just as impactful is their motivation. And I went to this International Literacy Association webinar with Mel Duke, very, very important researcher out of the University of Michigan. She researches a bunch of different things, but comprehension is one that she is really focused on. And so in this particular webinar, she was speaking about motivation for a second. And she said, from a researcher's perspective, this is what I know about motivation. And so she said this. Sometimes people think of motivation as a property of an individual. He or she isn't very motivated. That's not really how motivation works. Research suggests that motivation lies very heavily in the social context. Motivation is largely driven by the social context. I love this. I love this because it's not, when we have a child, we all have a child in our classroom or in our school, and they're not motivated. Let's just say they're not motivated to read. That is not a personal characteristic. It is not because Victor as a person isn't motivated. It is because the environment around Victor is not motivating. And the reason that I love this as a teacher is because we have some control over that. I don't necessarily have control over Victor's attributes as an individual, but I do have control over the environment around Victor to try to make it more motivating. So I love this idea that this is just not really the way motivation works. It's about the social context. So there are a lot of ways to make the social context more motivating, but here are 3 ideas. So I'm going to say community, celebration, affirmation. Community. Reading should be done in a community. Reading should not be something that's only in a lesson or an independent time, but that it should be social, that kids should get to interact around books. I've seen a lot of incredible teachers do incredible things with books in their community. And I've heard teachers call them reading rituals. That's something that you do the same way every week or every day. I've seen reading rituals. This one on the left comes from a teacher who is using our Phonics and Fluency curriculum. And these are our decodable readers on the left. And once a week for 5 minutes, everybody can find somebody they want to read with, grab their decodable, and then go to their favorite story, and they get to read it all together for 5 minutes, and then they go back. I've seen ones where you do book swaps. So Tuesday's always a book swap day where you take a book out of your book baggie or a book that you like to read and you go swap it with a friend. I've seen ones where we do every Wednesday as a book talk. So one person can talk for 2 minutes about a book that they hate or love, and then see if anybody else in the classroom wants it. I'm sure you all have your reading rituals as well. If you want to drop any of those in the chat, that would be amazing. But the idea with a ritual is that it happens, that, once it's in place, it happens. The kids are used to it. And so we need those things in our classroom that help build community, because that can lift a child's motivation. Celebration. We should celebrate kids every step of the way, and not when they pass a level or pass a test. I think that if we could just stay away from that a little bit, you're going to have kiddos who work their butts off and they don't pass, and you're going to have kiddos who don't work very hard and they pass. And if we tie celebration to passing, it just sends the wrong message to kids. But we could celebrate a child every time they finish a book. That could be a big moment. We can celebrate a child when they persist, those sorts of things. But we need to celebrate them publicly. We need to make it visible. And then that final piece is just affirmation, that a child can never receive enough affirmations from us. Telling them all the beautiful, wonderful things about, who they are and about themselves as a reader. So I'll keep that there, but I'll say, really, as you're thinking about little kiddos who aren't very motivated to read, what could we change around their environment that might make them more motivated to read? So now, number nine, reading levels. This is a great one too. What research has to say about reading instruction. This is coming out of chapter 3. That's more about reading comprehension, but something they say here and multiple other researchers have said is it is absolutely wrong to think that a child's reading level is rigid, fixed, or set. It's not. And so one passage from here is a study, and they're trying to kind of figure out, does a child have one reading level? And it says, no, that a child's comprehension changes book by book based on how interested they are. And then also based on their background knowledge and a host of other factors. So you don't have a fixed reading level. You might be taught at a level in a 20-minute lesson for a time, but that's not your overall level. And that's just really important. And he says here, too many times we think that students have a predetermined reading level, when in reality, studies have shown that your reading level varies text to text, book to book. And then in the Handbook of Research on Reading Comprehension in Chapter 24, they say reading levels float. That's what they say. They float depending on a person's interest in the topic. So what's that all to say is, reading levels for kids can be really, really helpful for targeted small group instruction for a small amount of time, but not to permeate the entire classroom. And the tip here is, if a child wants to read a book, let them read a book. If they are super excited about a book and we think the book is too hard for them, if they love the book, remember that interest is a buffer for challenge. So, can you read a book 5 levels above where you are? No, but could you read a book 2 or 3 levels above where you are if you're really interested? Probably. And so we don't want to hold kids back from books that they're really, really interested in. So just remember, reading levels helpful for this small group. Otherwise, they float, and a lot of different factors, but especially interest, is coming into play here. Okay, so now last tip. So the last tip here is reading joy. This, her name here is Donalyn Miller, and I just recently started going to different webinars and courses that she has. She's fantastic. So if you ever see, she's a teacher, she's an author, she's a staff developer. I think she does everything independently. She's excellent. I would go to all of her stuff, and the reason why is because she is equal parts research and inspiration. And I think that is so important. She has all the research to back up what she is saying. And she is so inspiring around her love of reading and her desire for kids to love to read too. So that's a plug to go to anything that you see from her. And then she has a line that I like. She says, we cannot create joy, but we can create the conditions for joy to emerge. I think that's really nice. We cannot create joy for our students, but we can create the conditions for joy to emerge. And so as we're thinking about joyful students, there are so many ways to create sort of joyful conditions. But 3 things that she comes back to again and again, and we've touched on in this webinar. One is access. Like, do kids have access to books that they want to read? Do they have that access? 2, do they have time? Are we packing their day so full that they don't ever get to pick up a book that they want to read in the school day? So do they have time? And then 3, are we building a community? Is reading something we're doing only in isolation or only in a lesson? Or is there a community of reading and rituals and that kind of thing? So I think that's a nice thing to think about. Okay, the conditions, like, do we have access? Do we have time? And then do we have a community of readers? I wasn't planning on sharing this study, but it's an incredible study. And again, I could send it out afterwards with the correct citations, but it's a study I read in the last 2 weeks out of the University of Nevada, University of Texas, Austin, and then a university in Australia. It's a 20-year study, 20 years. They followed children from birth to 18 years old in 27 different countries to say what happens, what's the difference when a child has access to a 500 book library from the time they are 0 through 18, that they have access to 500 books. In this case, they were able to take those home, have those books all throughout those years. What they found was kids that had access to 500 books from 0 to 18 made between 3.2 years and 3.7 years more growth compared to somebody that did not have access to those books. I know that a lot of us do not have control over our school's budget, and if you have any control, buying books is always a good investment. Always, always, always. All the research tells us that if children have access to more books that they love, they will read more and they will grow more. So access to books couldn't be more important. So those are the 10 tips. And in just a moment, I want to share how to get you access to the different visuals and resources that I was sharing. But before I do that, I want to say that more important, and I got to get this study out, more important than any of these 10 tips that I shared is all of you. Teachers matter more than any individual research point. And I pulled this study out from John Hattie. He's the director of the Melbourne Education Research Institute. He's been doing research for 40 years or more. He reviewed 50,000 studies to find that, I'm just going to read this exact, the greatest influence on student progress in learning is having highly expert, inspired, and passionate teachers. I'm going to read it one more time. The single greatest influence on student progress in learning is having highly expert, inspired, and passionate teachers. It's more important than anything else. It's more important than your curriculum, your testing, your school day. And I think that is so empowering. So I hope that feels empowering to you. And I also hope that you have picked up a new tip or two that you can use in your classroom. In our last couple of minutes together, I just want to briefly, a couple of minutes, share what we do, and then get you access to the survey if you want to receive any of the materials from today. So just really quickly about us at Lifelong Readers. We're really, really passionate to work with schools to help develop skilled, confident readers, to help foster and develop skilled, confident readers. So we have 2 curricula. We have K4 guided reading, that's where we do comprehension, vocabulary, knowledge. We have K2 phonics and fluency, that's where we do reading foundational skills. And more than that, I think the pillars that guide us, the first is kids deserve to read books that they love. Nobody loves to read if they don't love the books they're reading. And so that's really, really important to us. And for us, that means engaging books, books with diverse characters, and books with big themes. So we have decodable texts on our phonics and fluency. We have authentic texts on our guided reading. And then when kids get to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, they read text sets, one central fiction novel with all kinds of informational articles around it so they can build knowledge on a single subject. And then a second pillar is that we believe that a curriculum should be complete and comprehensive, that a classroom teacher needs to focus on adapting, differentiating, being data responsive, data driven, all of those things. As classroom teachers, we can only do that if we have a complete and comprehensive curriculum. So we have all the lesson plans, all the visuals, the student work, everything comes with it. And we also believe in putting research front and center always, always. So we, just like this training, we have it front and center in our design, and then we also have it front and center in our trainings. And then finally, we have support through the year. So we offer PDs like this to our schools, to teachers, to leaders. We have those meetings, and then we have a ton of lesson videos. So I showed 4 short lesson videos today. I think we have 300 or 400 videos, short lesson videos of teachers so that we can all learn from each other. And our hope and our dream is that we have created a curriculum that can inspire kiddos to become lifelong readers. That is our greatest passion. And so to share with you, we also have free resources. And so here, all of our free resources on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, all of that, those are there. So if you want to check those out for anything that's free. And then also we have a survey that in just one moment, I'm just going to drop in the chat if you want to fill it out now. We'll also send it in an email. And what it's going to do is ask if you want the resources. And if you want the resources, we'll send those directly to you. And that is specifically for teachers or school leaders. So I'm going to get that link and put it in the chat. Feel free at this point, if you want to drop in any questions or any thoughts that you have, feel free to do that. It'll take me about 20 seconds to get this link. And then to anybody who is going to head out before that time, I just want to say thank you for coming. Thank you very much. I know how exhausting it is to be a teacher and to be a leader. And so thank you for being here. And I wish you all the best in your teaching. And momentarily, I'll drop the link into the chat.